Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War is often seen as the peak of its 18th century power. In reality, it was the direct cause of its greatest imperial failure. The conflict left Britain with a vast new empire in North America and control of the seas. But it also created a hidden, fatal constraint. That constraint was debt. Securing global dominance cost a staggering £133 million, a sum that destabilized the British economy. Parliament, facing immense pressure, imposed new taxes on its own citizens and enacted severe austerity measures. The Royal Navy, the very instrument of victory, saw its budget plummet from £7 million to just £1.5 million by 1769. Even these drastic cuts were not enough. As London scrambled to balance its books, new crises compounded the problem. Pontiac's rebellion in the Great Lakes region forced an expensive military response. The resulting proclamation of 1763, which restricted colonial expansion, required a permanent garrison of British troops in North America, adding another £320,000 to the annual deficit. With British citizens taxed to their limit and the military budget slashed, Parliament was left with only one viable target for new revenue: the American colonies. The stage for conflict was set not by ideology, but by accounting. King George III found himself at a critical juncture. With his British subjects already shouldering a heavy tax burden and core institutions like the Royal Navy facing severe budget cuts, the only remaining source of revenue appeared to be across the Atlantic. From London's perspective, the logic was simple. The American colonies should bear a share of the costs for their own defense. The colonists, however, perceived a growing distance from their motherland and were unwilling to submit to the demands of a remote government. The first test of this policy was the Sugar Act of 1764. More than just a tax on sugar and molasses, it was a comprehensive enforcement mechanism. It required merchant captains to post bonds and provide exhaustive cargo invoices, while authorizing the Royal Navy to seize any vessel suspected of smuggling. Colonial merchants argued this was a direct infringement on their rights to free trade. But this was only the beginning. In 1765, Parliament introduced the Stamp Act, a direct tax on all paper goods, from legal documents to playing cards. A similar tax was already a major source of revenue in England, but its application in America ignited mass outrage. The protests were so widespread and effective that Parliament was forced to repeal the Stamp Act in 1766. However, in a critical move to reassert its authority, Parliament immediately passed the Declaratory Act. This legislation stated unequivocally that it had the power to make laws for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. The conflict was shifting from economics to raw power. Soon after, the Townshend Acts imposed new taxes on imported goods like glass and tea. In response, Samuel Adams, writing on behalf of the Massachusetts legislature, called for a widespread boycott of British products. The core of the colonial argument was now clear, crystallized in the enduring slogan, "No taxation without representation." The dispute was no longer just about money. It was about the fundamental right to consent. While King George III initially expressed a surprising degree of empathy for his American subjects, his Prime Minister, Lord North, viewed the escalating crisis through a different lens. North was a firm proponent of maintaining Parliament's absolute authority over the colonies, which he considered a vital component of the British system. The matter was rapidly shifting from a dispute over taxation to a non-negotiable conflict over power, setting the stage for a military solution. The first flashpoint occurred in Boston on March 5, 1770. Latent tensions between civilians and soldiers erupted when British troops fired into a harassing crowd, killing 5. Coined the Boston Massacre by colonial propagandists, the incident became a powerful symbol of British oppression. After the Boston Tea Party, Parliament responded with the Coercive Acts in 1774, which included the reinforcement of the Boston garrison. Far from quelling the unrest, the sight of more redcoats and the legal requirement for colonists to quarter them only intensified American anger. By February 1775, Lord North had officially declared the colony of Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. This declaration authorized the Commander-in-Chief, General Thomas Gage, to suppress the insurrection by force. Gage was ordered to capture rebel leaders and seize their ammunition. Acting on these orders, he dispatched troops toward a known ammunition store in Concord on April 19, 1775. At Lexington Green, his column encountered a colonial militia. An unknown shot was fired, prompting the British to fire into the militia, and the war began. On their retreat to Boston, the British forces were continuously ambushed by colonial militias, suffering heavy casualties. The escalation culminated 2 months later at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Though British troops eventually seized the high ground overlooking Boston, they paid a devastating price, suffering over 1,000 casualties. This Pyrrhic victory demonstrated that the colonial forces were not a disorganized rabble. The British army was now effectively trapped in a defensive siege, proving that the rebellion could not be easily crushed. The path from protest to open war was complete. The costly victory at Bunker Hill shattered any remaining patience in London. Even the once empathetic King George III now lamented Britain's soft approach, urging that the full might of British power be brought to bear on his rebellious subjects. This shift was formalized in August 1775 with the proclamation of rebellion, which froze American assets and banned their ships from British ports. The conflict also fractured colonial society, creating deep internal divisions. Loyalists sympathetic to the Crown faced hostility and ostracization from their patriot neighbors, with many forced to flee to Canada or Britain. This internal strife demonstrated the conflict was as much a civil war as a revolution. To crush the rebellion, Britain dispatched a massive force, 20,000 regulars and an additional 10,000 troops leased from German states, most notably Hesse. These Hessians were not individual mercenaries, but organized units provided by German princes through diplomatic agreements. As these reinforcements were en route, the Continental Congress made a final attempt at reconciliation with the Olive Branch Petition. But the king refused to even read it, viewing the colonists' actions as an open rejection of his government. After being forced to evacuate Boston in March 1776, British command shifted its focus to New York. In August, at the Battle of Long Island, General Howe nearly encircled and destroyed Washington's army, but a combination of fog and favorable winds allowed nearly 10,000 Continental soldiers to escape across the East River. This near miss was a critical strategic failure. Buoyed by his victory, a confident Howe attempted to dictate peace terms, demanding the Americans retract their recently signed Declaration of Independence. The proposal went nowhere. Britain had demonstrated military superiority, but failed to deliver a decisive knockout blow. This survival of the Continental Army was the signal France had been waiting for. Seeing that the rebellion was viable, the French officially entered the war in early 1778. The conflict was no longer a colonial uprising, it was a global war. The immediate impact was a catastrophic diversion of British resources. In 1778, 5,000 troops were withdrawn from Philadelphia, not to fight Washington, but to reinforce the strategically vital West Indies against a potential French attack. The American theater was no longer the Empire's sole priority. With the Northern theater stalemated and global war diverting resources, Britain executed a strategic pivot in 1780. The new Southern strategy was based on the assumption of strong loyalist support in the South, and it began with a major victory, the capture of Charleston, South Carolina, along with 5,000 colonial troops. General Sir Henry Clinton, the British Commander-in-Chief, envisioned a grand pincer movement. He would anchor the North in New York, while General Charles Cornwallis pushed north from the Carolinas, squeezing the rebellion into submission. Cornwallis began his march, but the campaign proved far more grueling than anticipated. His victory at Guilford Courthouse in March 1781 cost him a quarter of his force, a Pyrrhic win that left the American army intact and able to retreat. Frustrated and with his supply lines stretched thin, Cornwallis made a fateful decision. he moved his exhausted army to the coastal town of Yorktown, Virginia, to rest and await resupply by the Royal Navy. This logistical move created a fatal vulnerability. The trap was sprung not by land, but by sea. In September, a French fleet decisively defeated the British at the Battle of the Capes, sealing the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis was now cut off from reinforcement or escape. Meanwhile, in New York, General Clinton remained convinced that Washington was preparing a major assault on his position. Washington masterfully exploited this fixation, feigning an attack on New York while marching the bulk of the American and French armies 400 miles south. By late September, their combined forces laid siege to Yorktown. With no relief coming from the cautious Clinton and his army starving, Cornwallis's position was hopeless. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered his entire force of over 8,000 soldiers. The war's decisive military blow had landed. Despite the catastrophic loss at Yorktown, King George III initially demanded the fight continue. However, Parliament recognized the grim arithmetic. The financial and logistical costs of prolonging the war were entirely unsustainable. The 1783 Treaty of Paris officially ended the conflict. Britain conceded United States sovereignty, vast territories east of the Mississippi, and vital fishing rights, while returning Florida and Minorca to Spain. By November 1783, the last British troops departed New York. The sting of this imperial loss lingered deeply within the British establishment. It would take decades of friction before forging the deep-rooted Anglo-American alliance we recognize today. History teaches us, if we listen,